Hi, thanks, Amos. As you mentioned, I'm here to speak about COVID Collab, which was like a citizen science study we set up in like 2020. So the name implies to look at COVID. It started out like, well, the background to it was maybe in like the radar MDD study, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. I'm wanting to set up like a similar study to monitor symptoms of depression, but from a sort of citizen science angle, so just getting people to donate data from their own wearables and to download an app and give us some information. But basically quite a sort of low contact on our sort of end from the general public rather than the sort of quite involved clinical-based recruitment that was going on in radar CNS. But then with the like appearance of COVID, like at that point we had like, it was like kind of on the back burner and it was like half implemented and so on. But then with COVID, we sort of rebranded it and released it for the pandemic in around June. Yeah. So a large part of that delay was persuading Google to actually let us publish the app. So I was just going to go through some of the general study, like the technical background, some of the analysis we've done, some of the analysis we might do. So yeah, as I mentioned, it was like sort of starting off as this RMT collection app based heavily on the radar like active app, but with the ability to like recruit people remotely and to collect a certain amount of passive data as well within the same app. So yeah, we released that for COVID Collab. It was subsequently, or it has also been used in a study called Convalescence, which I'll mention briefly in the future. The infrastructure, I mean, it's, whereas there's overlapping functionality with parts of radar-based, which I decided to re-implement for no good reason, I guess. But then there's also actual radar-based in there as well, particularly around collecting the passive data. Most of the re-implementation was just essentially using sort of aspects of the Google Cloud platform to like schedule notifications or to store data and so on. Yeah, the app itself, it has like some ability to, you know, like read some radar active ARMT definitions and so on, or to display different questionnaires, you know, kind of similar to the active app. And then in addition, it lets you like connect your Fitbit account or your Garmin account and so on. And also has a little bit of feedback of, you know, you can view some of your previous responses and this sort of thing, which we thought might help retention in some way, although it's unclear. So yeah, it launched in like mid 2020. And then yeah, initially we got like 1,000 or so participants through just sort of newspaper articles and yeah, like general publicity. And then like the vast majority of the recruitment happened basically through Amos managing to get it into the Fitbit app or like publicized by Fitbit essentially. And then we got like an additional 15,000 or so people essentially through that. So we ended up with like 17,000-ish people of like maybe like 11,000 of which had like Fitbit account connected, and we have like 500,000 so surveys or something to do with either mental health or COVID. Yeah. So probably given its like background or it's like origin in sort of trying to ape radar MDD, we kind of focused a lot on, or we ensured that we included things like a PHQ8 and GAD7 and so on from the beginning, which I think was maybe like prescient given subsequent long COVID things and like long-term mental health effects of COVID and the public health measures that were implemented. So in the study, we collect mostly Fitbit data. We did later on also add the ability to connect Garmin accounts as well, but given that most participants came through Fitbit, like the vast majority of our data is from Fitbit devices. And then there's some like static phone statistics, are not like the same sort of time series that you get from radar. I mean, there was like, originally there was location data, but Google made us remove it after a while, for some reason. Yeah, and then on the active side, it's like COVID-related things, symptoms, which is prompted for like twice a week, and then asking whether you've been vaccinated or diagnosed with COVID. And then on the like mental health side, there's a relative valence scale that you can fill in alongside the symptoms, and like a PHQ8 and GAD7, which are prompted for every 2 weeks. Yeah, initially the idea of this study was to, when we first started it up, it was really to like see if we could use mHealth to predict or detect acute COVID, but then sort of by the time we came around to analyzing a lot of this stuff, it seemed like long COVID was more like pressing or interesting, and perhaps a better use of sort of this longitudinal data than trying to predict like an acute infection. Although we, or at least some group of master's students, have also like looked at predicting acute COVID from this data set, but I'm not talking about it today. So initially, we just wanted to see essentially whether there are any like long-term effects, even like visible or noticeable in any of our features following an infection of COVID, and then to see whether there were like group-wide differences if we group people into people who have had COVID and not had COVID. If we look, 12 weeks in the future, is there actually a significant difference between the groups? And then thirdly, to try and come up with some sort of way of saying whether somebody has long COVID or has persistent symptoms, and then given that categorization to identify risk factors for developing long COVID. Some of which are like socio-demographic things, and some of which are sort of looking back from, as Richard was speaking about earlier, like since we ask for data from people's existing devices, we can have like a lot of historic data from just however long that they have personally owned a Fitbit. And so we can see some of these like risk factors that we looked at were things like how active they were in like, a year ago or something like that, before that they became infected, or what their sleep quality was like in the year leading up to infection and that sort of thing. So just from like a visual perspective, it's like there's clearly the sort of central line, which is quite faint, is the day that a person becomes infected, and then just like the group level, very clearly sort of persistent changes and clear like acute changes, and then in some of the features like heart rate and some of the mental health self-rated scales, there are like persistent changes that last, in this case it's like 168 days, but potentially beyond that, given that they don't like return to the mean or return to the baseline level. And then again, this is the like self-rated, or this is the symptom questionnaire that we ask for a couple of times a week. And so again, the middle of the plot is roughly when they're infected, and then obviously there's a large acute phase people report a lot, but then for certain things, there is a persistent, a continuation of those symptoms for like a longer period of time than you might think. So yeah, because we don't necessarily know if somebody definitely doesn't have COVID, but so to form a sort of control group, we took people who were like quite active in the study, but like didn't report a diagnosis. And in addition, we tried to like age and sex match them to be people with a COVID diagnosis, and to also take the same time period around the infection. So for each person with COVID, we took someone who was like similar to them, took the same period of time, so that things like lockdowns and this sort of thing, or other seasonal effects, shouldn't matter as much. And then we looked at whether there were like differences in the distribution of some features, like during the acute phase, the ongoing phase, which is like between 4 and 12 weeks, and then the post-COVID phase, which is 12 plus weeks. Categorization of which we just took from the NICE guidelines. And then all these, essentially, there are sort of long-term differences in all of the mental health metrics. And then in addition, sort of like sleep efficiency and resting heart rate also seem to have longer term effects, although they are like slowly returning to baseline levels. We included the heart rate variability from Fitbit here, but the actual data completeness of it is not very good. So it could be that there's a difference in heart rate variability, but we just don't have very complete data at all for that. Then subsequently, we wanted to look at risk factors, and so we don't have like a very great label for whether somebody definitely has long COVID or not. Partly because it's not very well, or not very completely diagnosed, and partly because somebody might not necessarily know or have it diagnosed if they just have fairly mild COVID, which is a lot of our participants. We do ask for like a post-COVID functional scale after you report a COVID infection, which says whether they have like severe difficulties or various post-COVID functional questions. But we wanted to look at basically whether we could try to categorize someone based on if there is a change that happens to their passive data at the point of infection, and if that change is like sustained for a long period of time, and we categorize them as like having long COVID. That was one way that we looked at it, and the other way was essentially, which Yafaf sort of focused on, which was the symptom-based long COVID, which was if somebody just consistently reports symptoms after being infected for like 12 weeks or more, then we would also categorize that as long COVID. Going to mention or look at mostly just on the basis of having like a higher persistent heart rate when compared to baseline. Because that's what I did rather than what you both did. So it was basically just a regression between the change in heart rate between like baseline heart rate and at 12 weeks after being infected, and a regression against various sort of features like age and sex, and then the sort of historic features that I mentioned before. So like historic activity is the sort of average daily amount of time you spend in the very active category that Fitbit gives you for like how they rate Fitbit rate your activity into like sedentary, light, medium, or like very high. And it was just the amount of time you spend a day in the very high activity in the sort of year prior to being infected. And then, so age was like significantly correlated with this. Female sex wasn't, which is, although it was close to being, I guess. I mention that because in other studies, female sex is correlated with long COVID or development, a risk factor for long COVID. And then, yeah, historic activity as well. In our case was, so somebody who was more active in the past was less likely to get long COVID in the future if you buy the idea of long COVID as a persistent increase in heart rate. Yeah, so that was the long COVID bit. Oops. So convalescence, I think, is like a national core study. It's run mostly by UCL, I think, which takes a bunch of people from various like cohort studies, like Twins UK and so on, and like does a bunch of like deep phenotyping things, a lot of clinical tests and so on. But in addition, they give them a Garmin device and they give them the mass science app and they track them for a little bit. So I think the nice thing about the convalescent study is we can perhaps like test some of the like ideas we've got from COVID Collab, except in a much more sort of thorough manner in participants who we know a lot about from like medical history and this sort of thing, and actual clinical tests, etc. The other thing I looked at a bit was adherence in the study. Like obviously it's a sort of citizen science study where you kind of have, I mean, it's basically just me and like Amos and Yufaf. So we don't exactly have like a lot of bandwidth to interact with participants or phone them up if they're not submitting data or something like that. So yeah, obviously there's quite a lot of drop off, which I think you might expect. But there's also sort of a subset of maybe 15 to 20% of people who are just extremely keen, apparently, and keep chugging through forever. But there's also other ways in which like adherence could affect your analysis. So some people are like quite spotty and they'll do a questionnaire and then they'll skip a few weeks and they'll do another one and so on. And that can have an effect if you're trying to sort of work out whether somebody actually has symptoms during that period or whether they don't have symptoms or if they do have symptoms but they're just not filling things in for that period. Then just sort of like Cox regression against the length of stay in the study. Obviously, there are, I think it's not too surprising, but you know, things like if you're older, you're slightly more likely to stay in the study, or if you're depressed, you're slightly more likely to drop out, this sort of thing, which is maybe not surprising, but I guess definitely has implications on analysis if you're trying to work like somebody's not submitting data because they're depressed and you're interested in depression. It's an issue. So yeah, but apart from like COVID related stuff, there is potentially room to actually do like sort of the original sort of aims around mood and that sort of thing. I mean, we do have like a lot of PH grade and GAD7 responses and the same sort of data in radar MDD, at least Fitbit data. We don't have the phone data. We also have like location data, which is for raw location, so we can potentially like sort of contextualize certain pieces of location data more thoroughly than sort of the like pseudo-anonymized location of the radar MDD study, just to see if actually having raw location is helpful. Whether, you know, yeah. Thanks. Thanks to Yafaf and Amos as well for, you know, especially.